But ladies and gentlemen, our first speakers this afternoon are Gary Pearce and Carter Wrenn. They are experienced, they're well-respected political consultants. And I said earlier, all of you, if you've been in political circles in North Carolina, you've heard the names of Gary Pearce and Carter Wrenn. I'm going to let them tell you more about the friendship that they have developed in a moment. But in short, they used to be political rivals, and they'll talk about that. And now they frequently work together. We've invited them here today to share their thoughts about not only the past, but the present and the future of North Carolina politics. As we begin, let me stress to all of you that we've got microphones out there. We intend for this to be an interactive session. And we would ask you to come forward as they begin to talk, or get into their talk. If you've got a question, they want it to be interactive. So with that in mind, I think it would be best to start off by having Gary and Carter tell you the story about how they got started working together. So I would turn it over. Which of you gentlemen would like to start?
Well, I'll start. I always like to have the first.
Can you
word.
hear him in? Can you hear him in the back? You may.
Play.
You turn the volume. They'll turn. You're okay. They will turn the volume up a little bit.
All right. In 1984, when Jesse was running for the Senate against Hunt, we started out way behind. And Jesse never debated anybody in any campaign. And I had the bright idea, since we were so far behind, we'd challenge Hunt to a debate. And knowing full well he'd never accept. And so we did. Jesse told me he didn't think it was a good idea, but we did. And then we sort of caught up and the race got tighter and we got mousetrapped. And Hunt came back and said, yeah, he'd be glad to debate. So I met Gary when we were negotiating the rules and the format for the Helms-Hunt debates. And the first time we met in a lawyer's conference room over on Glenwood Avenue. And there was 4 of us in there with the Broadcasters Association. We were trying to get them to air the debates. And there was no trust at all in this room. I mean, this was one cold atmosphere. And as far as I was concerned, I was looking across the table at an absolute devil. And, you know, it sounds pretty simple, setting up debate rules. We must have had about 6 meetings trying to agree on the format of the debate. And finally, it dawned on Tom Ellis and I, who were there for Helms, that we really were closer to agreeing with Gary and Phil Carlton than we were with the broadcasters, which was a shock. So in one meeting, we finally said to the broadcasters folks, why don't y'all step out of the room a minute and let us talk? So we then agreed to the format in about 10 minutes and went ahead and had 4 debates, which from Gary's side of the fence were delightful, but from my side were complete disasters. The second time we met was the Sanford Faircloth debates. And we walked in and I sat down and Gary looked up and I hadn't seen him in 8 years and he grinned and he said, I guess this time we can both agree we don't want anybody to be able to use videotapes from these debates in television ads. And we got to be friends in the late 90s after we both sort of burned out on politics. And we found that we didn't agree on hardly a single issue, but that we did agree on the things that mattered in politics. You know, it's sort of like we agreed on what made the engine run better. We didn't agree on where the car ought to go at all. But that was basically the foundation of when we started working together and talking and getting to be friends. Now, my view on politics is, and this I'm going to talk generally for a minute. And if anybody wants to interrupt with a question, do it. Politics operates in two worlds in America. There's what I call the big world. And in this world, there are 6 million voters. And this is the start of all political power in America. It comes out of this world. Because the other world, the small world, is the world of elected officials and legislators and staffs and bureaucrats. And nobody gets into this little world unless they can win an election in this big world. So this is the dominant world. And what equates to power in this world is information. People decide who they vote for based on information. Tom Tillis, it's not much of an overstatement to say, was elected because he conveyed one piece of information to voters, that Kay Hagan supported Obama. That's power in this world, the ability to convey information, whether it's through a television ad, a radio ad, on the internet, through the free press. If you don't have a super PAC, get one, because that's becoming the dominant purveyor of information in this world. This other world over here, this little world, it basically runs on self-interest. Legislators' interest, governors' interest, their staff's interest, the Assistant Secretary of Agriculture's interest, and relationships to some extent. And if you're going to be a player in this, or a lobbyist has the most thankful task on earth, because all the power in this little world belongs to the elected officials. Legally, they have the power. All a lobbyist can do is persuade, reason, plead. A lot of groups, the Hospital Association is famous for bringing local people to Raleigh to meet with legislators, because that's in a way to be effective in that world. But it's a very complicated world to play in, and relationships with people back in districts matter a lot. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes what is an issue in this small world, tax reform, is coming down the pipe. And it did it a little bit 2 years ago. It's coming again. And if you've got an interest in tax reform, you better get politically active. Well, most issues stay inside the four walls of the legislature. They have no political consequences to a legislator, because nobody outside the legislature knows what's going on. Nobody in their district knows what's going on. It doesn't affect votes. But now and then, an issue breaks out of those four walls. And tax reform is an issue that will probably do that. And then the big world comes into play in the small world. The reason you get the NRA running ads in districts is because it affects how a legislator behaves in the small world. That's the basic balance of politics. And you've got to play both in the big world and the small world to be effective. Gary, I ran on longer than I thought.
It's all right. So far, he hasn't said anything I disagree with.
I must have messed up.
I'll talk a little bit about Carter and a little about politics, but Larry, I want to tell you this first. I am a dues-paying member of the North Carolina Farm Bureau. And the reason for that is I think I'm a member in Northampton County. Anybody here from Northampton County? Is that one of the, okay, good enough. The reason for that is my brother-in-law was an insurance agent for the Farm Bureau, so I think I own more Farm Bureau insurance than any human being in North Carolina. He would sell so much insurance, he'd get these trips. You know, he'd win these trips. Go to Hawaii and the Bahamas, and he'd always send me a postcard that said, "I'm having a lovely time, please pay your premium promptly." If you'd told me 31 years ago, when I was working for Governor Hunt and Carter was working for Senator Helms, and we were first meeting each other in that room, Carter once described it right, it was filled with ice. There was no trust on either side. If you told me then that I'd be sitting up here 30 years later, and we'd be friends, and we'd be talking in a friendly way, and we have a blog together, talkingaboutpolitics.com. It doesn't cost you anything. We don't have any ads. We started that in part because we were forced about 10 years ago, I guess, Carter. We were forced to spend a lot of quality time together in a car. We got hired by a group that was fighting an issue, it was a health care issue, and the group wanted a Democrat and a Republican. So they got the two of us together. And then they wanted us to go around and raise money. It was a group of doctors and pharmacists. And they realized that if they got the two of us together and we put on a road show, people would come to it and we'd get money. And I remember one thing, Carter, you reminded me of this last week when we were talking to Paul about coming here. There was this one old doctor who was a leader of the group. His name was Bert Kofer. That was another sort of unlikely friendship because he was Senator Helms' best friend. And I got to know and really liked Bert. And we were speaking to this group of doctors one day. They were trying to get them involved in the group to influence the legislature and so forth. And this one old doctor stands up in the back of the room. He says, "Bert, I hear what you're saying, but I just ain't interested in politics." And Bert shot right back at him and said, "Well, I'm sorry, you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And that's why you're here, because politics is interested in you." I think about the 30 years since Carter and I were young enough and energetic enough and mean enough. Maybe it may just be we got old and we beat each other up so much. We're like two Civil War veterans who go back to Gettysburg 30 years later, and we really have more in common because we fought than we have different because we fought on different sides. We've been through the wars, and we've seen politics change a lot, a lot. The money has changed it. The explosion of money is incredible. North Carolina last year had what did it cost it? $100 million?
$110 million.
$110 million Senate campaign. One race, two candidates, $110 million spent in this state. Broadcasters are doing real well because that's where 80% of the money went. That's exploded. The polarization. I mean, we were pretty divided, Hunt and Helms. But it's not just political division anymore. People are divided in terms of where they live, where they go to church, who they associate with, what restaurants they go, what neighborhoods they live in. And increasingly, you see this in North Carolina, across the country, where they move to. I think an issue that's significant to you all is the urbanization of North Carolina. And the urban areas becoming more Democratic, rural areas becoming more Republican, and the suburbs are the places where things are fought out. And the other big difference that's so striking is, and this is from two people, you know, Hunt and Helms race for the time was sort of the state-of-the-art, mean, negative, dirty race. There are a lot of people with hair in here the same color as mine, and you may remember that. But even for us, it's sort of shocking how coarse the political debate has gotten. How mean, how personal, how divisive, how totally devoid of any concern for telling the truth is. It really has gone downhill. And it's easy to understand people who say, it's just too dirty, I don't want any part of it. But ultimately it comes down to, In this case, the reason you're here, 170 members of the legislature who are going to make decisions that affect you and the people you represent. You might want to talk more about this and be glad. But there's one other thing that struck me. Thinking back to the Hunt-Helms debates, we got interviewed last year by Tim Boyum, Time Warner News. He wanted to talk about debates, the Tillis-Hagan debates, and he compared them to the Hunt-Helms debate. And he put on a clip of Hunt and Helms 30 years ago, and I was really stunned at the difference. And I know we all say, oh, it was so much better back in my day and all that. But when you watched Hunt and Helms, no matter how you felt about them, they were two really smart, sharp, tough guys who knew what they believed and were very articulate about being able to say it. And then I watched Tillis and Hagan, and again, setting aside politics, it was sort of like wind-up dolls. I mean, it's like all they could do was sort of recite lines out of their ads. You didn't really get the sense of any kind of discussion going on. One thing really struck me about the 4 Hunt-Helms debates, Larry, how much time they spent talking about who could do a better job helping tobacco farmers. They spent a big chunk of 4 debates talking about that. When is the last time you heard a statewide debate in North Carolina talk, not just tobacco farmers, but about farmers? It is a real sign of how this state has changed and how the times have changed with it. But I think what Carter and I have sort of learned a lesson, which is it is possible, even today, to disagree, feel strongly about your beliefs, feel very differently about things, our view of the world, but get along with each other. And if it hadn't been, it was really Carter's idea. He doesn't remember doing it. It was his idea to do this blog because he realized when we were talking to these doctors, what people really wanted to know was what really goes on in politics. What happens, behind the door when nobody sees what's going on. And that's what we try to do. And what it has done for us is it's forced us out of our comfortable boxes. I don't have many Republican friends. I don't think Carter has many liberal Democratic friends.
One.
But we sort of, I'm it, yeah. I got like my one Republican friend, But that's probably one more than most people have, the way things have gone in politics these days. We would really rather respond to your questions, what you're interested in, what you want to complain about, anything. It doesn't take much to set us off. So tell us what you'd like to hear from us and what would be useful to you.
Gentlemen, I'll sort of moderate this. Kirk Mathis from Wilkes County is coming up. Kirk, what's on your mind for these two gentlemen?
With all the monies that we see in the political arena, where does our personal relationship with our legislators stand?
Well,
Does everybody understand the question? Personal, he said, with all the money that's being spent in political campaigns today, how important is a personal relationship with the candidates, with the political leaders, with the politicians? Am I correct there, gentlemen?
Yeah.
Carter, you first.
okay, let's go back to the two worlds. If an issue in the legislature moves into this world, that becomes the dominant force, and that's where most of the money gets spent. But 9 out of 10 issues don't get into this world. They stay in the legislature. And that's where relationships with elected officials, senators, and representatives matter a lot. I mentioned the Hospital Association earlier. They have literally, in terms of influencing legislators, made a practice for a decade of bringing up the board of the local hospital to meet with the legislators or inviting the legislators to meet at the local board banquet. And it's been effective as hell. So 9 out of 10 issues just stay in that little world, in that world, having lobbyists who understand the interest of the legislators, the power relationships, and having members of an organization involved who can deal with legislators in a completely different way is very effective. Now, when the issue, tax reform, is almost surely going to move into this world. And then you've got an even more complicated situation, because when voters start going one way or the other, it affects these people over here. And you need lobbyists who can essentially understand those political currents and turn them to their advantage.
In a way, it's hard to believe when you hear $1 billion campaigns, $100 million campaign. You think, how is a personal relationship going to make a difference? It makes a huge difference. As Carter says, that money plays out on sort of a national level. What it's really done is it's nationalized campaigns and how people are selected. Once they're there, personal relationships can influence. I mean, just the perfect story to illustrate that, Governor Hunt. I worked for him for 16 years when he was governor. He spends all his days, in the Capitol when the legislature's here. He's talking to legislators, lobbyists come in. He's got policy advisors, delegations come in, associations meet with him, on and on. Some issue, you hear all this. And you could sort of, people who wanted Hunt to do one thing or another, they could wire it all up during the week and get the right people to see him and, feel like everything was moving fine. Then Hunt would go home on the weekend, go to his farm on Rock Ridge. Somebody would catch him at church Sunday, some friend or a cousin, and tell him something different, and the whole thing is thrown up in the air, everything that everybody up here wanted to do, because he heard from a real person, and he heard a real story. And it was from somebody who wasn't just, paid to be in Raleigh, paid to be a representative, but somebody who lived it. Hunt gave me most everything I know about politics. I learned working with him. The first year I worked for him was 1976, first time he ran for governor. He gave me a piece of advice I have never forgotten and has never let me down in almost anything I do in my line of work. He said, never underestimate the intelligence of people. Never underestimate their intelligence. Never overestimate how much information they have. And that's the attitude you've got to take toward legislators. They vote on so many issues. Carter said 9 out of 10 issues don't sort of rise to the level of being in television ads. It's probably more like 99 out of 100. For that matter, and I know this will shock you, there are a lot of issues that legislators vote on that they don't know the first thing about. They are overwhelmed with issues. One story, one personal experience, one sort of testimony, if you will, from one real person who lives in their district can overwhelm everything else that happens in Raleigh, especially if they knew you before you called them on that. It's one thing if you're in the district and you call them up about something they've never heard of you. If you have cultivated a relationship with somebody, and of course that's a lot of definitions. You ask a politician, what should I do? How can I help my group? They'll tell you, get involved.
Yeah.
Get involved is code for, I have a fundraiser coming up, get your checkbook out.
Would y'all agree with that?
That is one way.
We know about that, getting involved.
Well, there's a different way, which is get to know them. Get to know somebody who knows them. Maybe they go to church with you. Maybe they're in a club with you. Maybe they walk somewhere, or they, take their grandchildren somewhere that you can run with them. But it is worth your while to cultivate a relationship before you need it, because then when you do talk to them, it's about 10 times more powerful than it is otherwise.
I would add one thing to that. I said a while ago that information is power. If you, and I mentioned super PAC, and I jokingly, but this is dead serious. If you want to have power in the political world, I mean, really have power of your own to exercise, if you have a super PAC or any political entity with the ability to convey information and affect the outcome of an election, that's power. And that doesn't mean you've got to go out and figure out how to elect a governor or lieutenant governor, but if you get into one state Senate election and you make a difference, that word gets around all the other politicians. And all of a sudden, instead of just being a piece of the political world, you're somebody that can exercise power in the political world, and all your relationships change for the better.
Yeah, politicians they're really sensitive. I mean, they are sensitive. Everything to them is, does this help me or does this hurt me? They do not want any enemies. And they're fully aware that they're going to cast hundreds upon hundreds of votes here in Raleigh in the next 6-8 months. Most of them you're not going to know about. You really don't have the slightest idea how they voted, and they know that. And if it's an issue that, well, nobody's going to know about this, they're likely to go with maybe what their leadership says or what their seatmate says or whatever. But all it takes is one voice from somebody at home to say, in effect, you say this without saying it, I'm watching. I know about this one. They pay attention. That's it. Carter's right. Information is power, and you have information both ways. You have information they need about how they should vote, then you have information to take home about how they did or didn't vote.
And each I'll do another 9 out of 10, although this is probably truly 99 out of 100. Their first goal is to get reelected. And if you can touch that, if you can affect that, giving money is one way, but having your own power politically, if you have the power to affect their getting reelected, you're in a whole different world with them than most people.
Carter, I know you work quite a bit at the federal level. One of those breakout issues that certainly is important to our farmers, important to this industry of agriculture, not only in North Carolina, but countrywide, is this issue of immigration. Does your theory on being a breakout issue, does that hold in terms of the reluctance of Congress and to really take on this issue and provide an answer? We've been working on it for so long.
Well, I think that you've really put your finger on you grabbed a really complicated one there. Here's the kind of politics of immigration. In North Carolina today, you got 4 basic political groups: Republicans, Democrats, who are sort of split. 80%, 85% of the Democrats really vote Democrat. Now, there's another 20% that are 15 or 20% who are sort of older and white and rural, who tend to vote Republican. They're the old Jesse-crats, if you will. And then there are the independents. They're your 4 groups. And if you're a Republican, you can take the Republicans for granted. You have to get that piece of the Democrats, and you have to win the independents. All right? If you don't, you lose. Now, with immigration, among your Republicans, they don't want any immigration. I mean, not all of them, but overwhelmingly, 80% are for less immigration. And if you're a Republican state senator or House member who's running in a safe Republican seat, these are the only people that matter to you. You're not going to lose a general election, but you might get knocked off in a primary. And if you vote for more immigration, you got a problem. So that's the first political piece to that equation. The second piece is when you move over here to the independents, which if you're in a statewide race or a swing race, they're a different view on immigration. Now, they're not all for open immigration, but like the children of people who came here as children and grew up here, the dream, I guess you call them dream kids, dream kids. They're not for sending them home a bit. You know, in this independent group, there are tons of mothers with children in school, and when you say, well, we're going to ship a kid that came here illegally home, they just dig right in and say, hell no, we don't like treating children that way. So the politics of it gets really complicated in a primary and in a general election. And the only way you ever, nothing's happening on immigration because it's politically gridlocked. The only way you're going to solve the immigration problem ultimately is if somebody sells people, gives people information that says, here's a reasonable solution, and gets enough Republicans and enough independents to agree on it, that it then goes through. And you might be able to solve pieces of it. You know, your piece with farm labor, you might be able to get a message through to solve that. But politically, you're talking about a minefield here, because if you're a Republican, this Republican group over here, they're perfectly capable of shooting you if they get mad at you on immigration. Shooting you if you're a candidate, which might be good. Maybe they shoot a lot of them.
Keith Beavers, you have a question, comment?
Yes, sir, Mr. Williams. You mentioned about super PACs and what it looked like that was going to be the future now. And we see these large super PACs on national TV and all that stuff. Is there a place for small super PACs within a county that may influence our commissioner races or local representative? Is there a place for that type of thing, and can it be formed, and will it work?
Yes, absolutely yes. I mean, you know, a county race, a district race, it doesn't take a whole heck of a lot. You're not talking about $100 million there. And you know, this is one of the things that Carter and I do agree on. This is really where we started working together with this group of doctors and pharmacists who had an issue that their side of the issue was very popular with the public. We know because we did a poll about it. But their issue had been sort of dealt with down in the bowels of the legislative process, behind closed doors. We had a very simple strategy. We're going to open up the doors. We're going to shine a light on it. We're going to let people know what's happening. And just the very fact that you say to a politician, and they're all running scared all the time, and it may just be in a primary. You know, most of the legislative seats, this is a fundamental problem with politics today, and Democrats are just as guilty as Republicans, is the gerrymandering. You know, the politicians pick their voters. And so generally most seats in the legislature are safe for one party or the other. But nobody's safe from a primary challenge. And if you come in as an independent force, super PAC or independent expenditure committee, whatever you want to call it, and you say, we're going to drag this issue up, it is a problem for them. There's a great example of this right now, is Renee Elmers. She lives in a unassailable Republican district. I mean, unless the world were just to blow up, a Republican is going to win that district 15, 20 points every time. She touched the third rail just last week, 2 weeks ago in Congress over abortion, which is one of those issues abortion, gay marriage, immigration, handful of issues like that that are just the most divisive things. I mean, you just put them on the table and the whole country goes like boom, splits. Maybe there are a few people in the middle that we split. Well, she touched that issue in the Republican Party. She made the 80% of Republicans who are pro-life mad. She could face a serious primary challenge over just that issue. And if your issue is immigration and policies that make it possible for farms to operate economically, and you just raise the specter in any district you want that we're going to make this an issue for you in your primary, if you're on the wrong side of it, you're going to get their attention. And if you do it early on, just the threat of it sometimes is enough.
I agree with Gary on the local super PAC, congressional district super PAC. So here's the thing, and this got away from the politicians a little bit. They lost control. In a campaign, there's a limit. I can take, in a federal campaign, $2,600 from an individual. You can take $5,000 from a PAC. That's it. There are no limits in a super PAC. An individual can give $1 million. A corporation can give. It's wide open. So the funding available to super PACs is phenomenally greater than the funding available to a campaign. And so actually, if you had a local super PAC, you really have a huge funding advantage over any local candidate. And therefore, your power is immensely magnified. Absolutely local.
Yeah, money is a hugely powerful thing in politics. I think Obama's campaign was the first campaign in the history of the country to raise $1 billion. A presidential campaign, $1 billion. I think Mitt Romney got close to that last time. Well, now the Koch brothers and their network say they're going to spend, almost $1 billion themselves. That is an independent entity that's just as big, just as rich, just as powerful as the political parties. That's a national level. You can divide it up and get down to your.
I know they may only spend $50 million here. Yes, sir.
Ken?
Yeah, thanks, guys, for giving us this chance to discuss some of this and coming today. Something that affected me recently, and that was the way Obamacare came before the legislature and the way it was passed. How do we, as voting citizens, correct that? And what I'm talking about is the size of that piece of legislation. Our elected officials said they didn't read it, they didn't know what was in it, but yet they passed it and still didn't know what was in it. And the way it was done, we just can't let that happen again, ever, with that kind of legislation. I'd just like to hear what you guys think about the way that was done.
Well, it's certainly been a gift that kept giving to Republicans. They've won the 2010 and 14 elections off of it. I don't think there are going to be a lot of changes in Obamacare now. There'll be some tweaking around the edges, but there's a great strength and a great weakness in our political system. It's the balance of powers. I mean, it's hard to get anything done in politics. They used to drive me crazy. I used to think, here we've elected Ronald Reagan and we should be able to cut the budget. We couldn't. And it was the balance of power. And eventually somebody told me, said, what the founding fathers were interested in is nobody having enough power to to be a tyrant, but it also means nobody has enough power to do much anything. And so my guess is you're going to have gridlock on changing Obamacare. And maybe if Republicans, win in 2016, they'll do something. But that's one fact. I mean, you got to get 60 votes in the Senate, and you got to get it by a veto, and it's probably not possible. And it's bad, but on the other hand, the system of government we have really fundamentally does work. I wouldn't want to have government more effective, Lord, to scare the pure hell out of me. There was another piece of that. Just flew right out of my mind, Gary.
It'll come back to you.
Yeah.
I suspect from your question, you and I might have a different idea about Obamacare, whether it should have passed or not. But I agree with you on one thing. The people who voted for it or against it didn't really know what it did. And that's not really a unique thing.
No, that's usual.
Every year, the legislature passes a budget, and 95% of the members don't know what's in it, in either party. It comes out of committee. Every budget is basically written by about 8 people. They throw it through the committee. They throw it on the floor. It's this big. We're going to vote this afternoon. They don't know most of what they're voting on. But really, to Carter's point, that is the exception to the rule in America. It is very rare that Congress ever, and I don't, we talk about gridlock now like it's something new. The history of this country is a history of gridlock. The greatest example of gridlock is we couldn't resolve slavery. So we went to war. The system, as Carter points out, the system is made not to work. It's made to slow things down, not to make it easy to get big, huge, sweeping things passed all the time. That really is the great wisdom of the Founding Fathers. And you go back through history, this is what always happens. About every 10, 20, 30, 40 years, a president and his party win a big landslide. Obama won big in 2008, got 60 votes in the Senate, all the votes he needed in the House. They had a 2-year window. They pushed through something big. Ronald Reagan, same thing after his election in 1980. The rest of the time, it was gridlock because there was reaction. Lyndon Johnson, 64, biggest landslide ever in history, passes all this legislation, the Great Society. 66, it turns around. We get 6 years of gridlock. That's really the way our system works. And it's probably a good thing because we can't absorb too much change too fast. And Obamacare, Democrats have been wanting a version of national health insurance since Franklin Roosevelt. They seized their opportunity, got a lot of problems with it. I tell you, there are a lot of good things in it. But, it's so complicated, not even sure what's in it. And if it gets repealed or the Supreme Court throws it out, nobody really knows what we got or don't have. Big
Question
and complicated. I'm sorry.
Excuse me, question to Mike. Henry.
I'm from Mecklenburg County, and when I talk to my legislatures, if I'm talking about Parks and Rec, if I'm talking about anything in the county, I've got their ear. If I talk about farming, they look at me and say, do we have farming in Mecklenburg County? Well, we do. Then we get into the issue of, well, that's an eastern issue or a western issue. My question is, how can we work together across this state? The rural, you mentioned earlier, the rural, the suburbs, on major issues like this where my delegation really doesn't think they're important. Somebody else's delegation thinks it's a top issue, but they need our votes. Or the thing that was brought up to me last week was the issue of money transfer from the so-called populous states to the rural states. So how can we work together here in North Carolina across that board of the urban and rural areas?
you got a real problem because the urban areas basically want to screw the rural areas. I mean, you know. I don't know that it's, I'd really have to think about that one a while. I don't know it's so much a thing of getting them to work together as really the swing vote is now in the suburbs. And that's what everybody's real interested in. I mean, if you're a Republican in the legislature, one of your major goals is to keep a Republican majority so you can stay head of a committee. And so you may be from Duplin County, but that swing vote in Tom Murray's district in Raleigh matters to you. And you brought up a great question, but I think really it's what your goal is, because I think you're going to see like road building money moving from rural to suburban pretty heavily, and the focus is going to be. I have a friend that's from a rural county, and he's raging all the time about, you know, they set up all these incentive programs to bring jobs to tier 3 counties, and hell, all the money's going to Raleigh and Charlotte. That's a tricky question, but that's a conflict that's going to continue. And primarily, you've got two different worlds in conflict. And right now, a lot of the political power is in the suburban world. Gary, you may do better with that than I could.
No, I tell you,
I didn't get far.
It's a hell of a challenge for you all, and it's just how much the world has changed. And 40 years ago, when I was working in my first campaign with Hunt, and these numbers aren't exactly right, but to get to half the vote in the state, half the voters in the state at the time lived in something like 30, 35 counties. You'd have to go to 35 counties to get to half the vote. Today is close to 15. The consolidation of the population, I mean, number one, enormous growth. We more than doubled in that time, but it's all consolidated. My parents from Hertford County, my wife's from Northampton County. People are leaving. All her siblings, my parents, left. They're coming to the cities. 40 years ago, there was Hunt, Democratic governor, lived on a farm. Lieutenant governor was Jimmy Green. He was a tobacco farmer. There were a lot of rural conservative Democrats who were from farms, who knew farming. It ain't that way now. And at that time, there were people who, even though they lived in cities, like me, I grew up in Raleigh, you're sort of one generation, your parents, your grandparents, in a rural area, so you had sort of an identification and knowledge. Today, the Democratic Party has become more urban, in part now because of gerrymandering. And so you have, and I expect not just Democrats, but Republicans representing Wake County, Mecklenburg County, Guilford County, Forsyth County, they would probably ask that same question. We got farms here? Really? You've got a big education job to do. And I think there's sort of a natural, you're popular, you know. So there's a natural inclination to want to help. But again, don't overestimate their knowledge about how many farms there are or how much money it generates. I mean, don't you kind of wish you could give them a pop quiz when you have your thing with them and ask them what's the number one income producer in North Carolina? You know, what's the business, industry, whatever, that generates the most money? I expect most of them don't know that. There's a huge information void, and it's a big challenge because it's continuing. You know, it's now, Billy, I've heard for 40 years, what are we going to do about rural economic development? Well, nobody's figured it out yet.
Ted Sewell.
I'm from New Hanover County, and believe it or not, we've got a lot in common with Mecklenburg County. New Hanover County, we haven't got any dirt left much that doesn't have a condo, apartment, or somebody's house on it. However, we are a consumption county. Mecklenburg is primarily a consumption county. We have other counties in the Farm Bureau that we look at as production counties. This is the thing that's got to be brought together and help these people in the consumption counties, like Mecklenburg, and these legislators, to understand that we're all in this together. You know, one can't live without the other. So therefore, we've got to sell that case that one is just as important as the other. Because if we didn't have consumers in these urban areas, the farmers would not do very well. If we didn't have farmers, the consumers would starve. Now, one of my pet comments to the legislators is I got a couple 100,000 people get up hungry every morning expecting to have some food that they can reasonably afford to eat. That's what New Hanover County Farm Bureau is in the business of, is helping to see that we've got that. Part of it is the legislative action to educate our legislators to know who we are, what we are, and why we need their help.
Well, let me throw a little bit of an alternative, because I don't think you're going to scare any legislator by telling them, you know, people are going to starve. But what it may say is that a super PAC would matter more in a suburban area than even a rural area. You know, if you were in New Hanover County, you might not be able to have as much influence on a legislature on farm issues as if you're in Pender County. So you probably need a bigger super PAC to influence them other ways. That would sort of be my inclination on that. And that would influence them plenty.
Gary, you have any comments?
If I could come up with a solution for you on this, I just think you are really struggling with a changing state, a changing level of knowledge. And you should not underestimate the sort of that knowledge and information gap that you've got to close here. And I see it particularly happening with the Democratic Party. Most of the young Democrats I know in Raleigh, they when they hear farms, they think organic,
Well,
some
yeah.
kind of thing, or farm to table, or something like that. They have no concept of what you're talking about, and as they rise up to the level of Attorney General or Governor, and I think this not really, I don't mean this as a partisan thing, but Roy Cooper is probably going to be the Democratic candidate for governor. I suspect he's going to be one of the last Democrats who runs statewide who has any type of rural background and upbringing. And if this state, if the demographics keep going the way they are, could well become, after the next redistricting in some time, much more Democratic state. And I think that's a challenge you've got to prepare for.
Let me go back to that question again about the rural and the suburban. It's really fascinating. And I'm going to get some of these facts wrong, but right now in the tax code, I believe there's an exemption for tractors and combines from the sales tax. And I think there's some property tax exemptions on farmland. Now, if you've got a legislator on your hands from Charlotte, and you go tell him taking away the exemption for tractors is going to make a lot of your constituents mad, he just flat ain't going to believe it and ain't going to move an inch. If you tell a legislator who's from Wilkes County the same time, he might think, damn right, there are a lot of people up here with tractors. In Charlotte, you need another lever. You can still influence what that guy does, but you can't do it with that lever. You've got to find a different one. Now, usually in politics, the way you find that other lever is with a poll. And I'll guarantee if you take a poll in Mecklenburg County, you'll find a lever that will allow you to move a legislator. That would be what my approach on that would be. And the other thing is, I don't want to see Roy Cooper as governor, but the flip side of this is you need to elect people from rural places to statewide offices. I mean, that would make, if Jim Hunt were governor, just because of where he grew up, how he looks at the world is completely different from Pat McCrory, who's from Charlotte.
Do you gentlemen see, you thought, obviously the biggest tool we have as farmers and agriculturists in protecting farmland, open spaces, the present use value, Carter, you talked about that. Do you see as the pressure on the legislature says we're going to cut here, does that put more pressure back down on the counties and have an impact on county commissioners? We have several county commissioners in this audience today. What do you see for the counties going forward in terms of the legislature that we have in session in place now?
There's a story in the News and Observer today. I'm not sure if this gets at your question, Larry, but I'll make a stab at it. Really struck me about the Wake County commissioners and teacher pay. And they've made up their mind, and all the commissioners are Democrats in Wake County. School board members, I think all but maybe one or two are Democrats. And they decided, in their view, the legislature's backing away from paying teachers fairly. So the Wake County commissioners and the school board want to say, we want to raise teacher pay in Wake County by raising our local supplement. We want to raise teacher pay to the national average. Well, Wake County is competing with Wilson County and with Johnson County and with every other county around here for the best teachers. My daughter's a senior, majoring in education, and she can tell you what she can get paid in every county and in every neighboring state. That divide we've been talking about today, where we've gone from being a very largely rural state to increasingly an urban state and a separate rural areas, that heightens that competition. And this becomes a self-fulfilling thing. If Wake County pays its teachers more, it's going to get the best teachers. Northampton County, Hertford County are going to suffer. That's going to affect the decisions of people with kids or employers, where they're going to go. And so it maximizes this thing. So I think we are in sort of we're getting into a situation where if we're not careful, we're going to have 10, 15 counties where people are doing very well, and 80, 85 counties where people are moving out. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but I think that's what's coming.
Part of it.
Let me take, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
What you have to understand, I think, about this legislature is that it does not believe in government. It does not believe government solves problems. And it's my impression, I'm not the world's greatest expert on the state legislature, but it's my impression that they have reduced funding for local governments. And this is purely and simply a reflection. It's two things. A little bit, I'm going to pass the buck. A little bit of that going on there. But basically, they would be happy and would think the world would be better off with less government at the state level and the local level and in towns. So I would expect you're probably going to see a continuing trend where funding is reduced for local governments, whether it is through tax reform or whatever else, because in their view, government's a problem. And the more they get rid of it or the more they shrink it, the better off the economy will be.
Henry Vines?
Y'all talked a little bit about this a little earlier about, the different voters. And the growing number of independent growers across the state is growing highly. With that number growing, how do y'all feel and how do you think that the politicians are going to have to address this in, getting those independent votes, and how they're going to know which ones of those they're going to be reaching. And because, the independent vote has gotten to where, it can decide the vote, the election. How do y'all see that?
Yeah, independent voters absolutely decide the vote. I mean, independents are growing faster than either party. And the numbers are staggering, especially young voters. Something like 50–60% of younger voters, the so-called millennials, register unaffiliated and independent. Because for them, I asked my daughter, I said, why is this? She says, because they're too cool for school. It is not cool to say I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican. Everybody says I'm an independent. Now, the truth is, it's roughly, I don't know, Carter, the numbers maybe are 40% Democratic registration, 30% Republican, 30% unaffiliated and rising. A lot of the unaffiliated voters really are Democratic or Republican voters. There may be 20% of the voters in this state are truly independent swing voters. And their level of interest, and this is also true of Democrats, Republicans are more reliable voters. We've got two separate electorates. There's a presidential year electorate, turnout's pretty high. There's off-year electorates, turnout's much lower, which is one reason we have these huge swings back and forth. But this also comes down to a matter of information, because a lot of the independent voters are low information voters, and a lot of them are pretty aggressive about it. I mean, they really are, they're cynical about it, they're tuning it out. I remember in the Senate race, Walmart invited some reporters to cover a focus group of undecided independent voters. They called them Walmart moms. These are like 10 or 20 female voters who were undecided in the Senate race about 3 or 4 weeks out. And they got them together and they asked them to talk about Hagan and Tillis. Just said to the group, tell me what you know about Hagan or Tillis. And keep in mind, this is after $100 million had been spent on television ads. And Hagan basically, her whole message was Tillis has ruined the schools. And Tillis's whole message was Hagan's too close to Obama. And they asked these voters, not to pick on women, but they happen to be women, what do you know about them? Silence. They weren't able to say anything about them. And finally, one voter said, I think I heard something about Tillis being against education or something. So information there is power. And, McCrory, his reelection depends on those independent voters. And I think the ones who are going to decide it really know very little about him. They say, well, he seems to be an okay guy. But there's a vacuum there. And the easiest way to fill that vacuum is with negative information. Because as much as voters will say, I hate negative ads, I turn them off, I don't pay attention to them, they remember the negative. And that's going to continue to be what decides elections, I suspect. So it's a volatile group, and that's what makes North Carolina one of like 4 or 5 true battleground states where the outcome's in doubt.
I think the independent's fascinating. First, they hate both parties. A lot to be said for that. They think all politicians are just blowhards. And, they watch Hagan, they watch Tillis, they watch them debate, and they say, that's just a bunch of bunk. Neither of those people is going to do a bit of good to solve my problems. They support government in the sense that they want more money spent on education. They want their parents' Medicare and prescription drugs paid for. On the other hand, they want less debt. And they are culturally, religiously they're fairly religious. They go to church. They're not cultural liberals. This is a very unusual person. It doesn't fit into any of our old stereotypes for voters. They've got some very conservative traits. They've got some liberal traits, and they dislike all politics and all politicians. And I think they're a pretty fascinating group of people. They're also primarily suburban. Now, there's some rural, but primarily this is a suburban vote. And there are a lot of people in that group that didn't grow up in the South. And that makes a huge difference in voting behaviors.
Dan Hunsucker, last question, and we're going to wrap up.
Well, we've talked about information, we've talked about money. Where's the best place to spend your money as a politician to get your information out?
Well, here's how I do it.
He's a county commissioner, too.
Okay. Everybody will make this more complicated than it is, but there's television, there's radio, there's cable television, there's digital ads on the internet, there's banner ads on the internet, there's mail, there's newspaper ads. I analyze them all based on what it costs me to talk to 1,000 people. In other words, if you will take George Holding is a friend of mine running for Congress in Raleigh, and I was looking at all those things, and I took broadcast TV, and I said, what does it cost me to reach 1,000 people on that? And the answer was $100 or something like that. I then looked at cable TV. Well, I can reach 1,000 people there for $175. Mail is going to cost you $450 to mail 1,000 people. You can just literally go it doesn't matter what medium you use. Just pick the one with the lowest cost per 1,000. Now, sometimes if it's like radio and you're buying country radio, you're not going to reach the whole world, so you may have to go buy something else. But basically, look at a cost per 1,000, rank it, and go from there.
Quickly, just as we wrap up, we appreciate both of your insights. Quickly, what can these county farm bureaus, these volunteers do at the local level to influence election outside of money, outside of PACs? What can our county farm bureaus do and be effective in impacting particularly state elections?
Adopt a legislator or two or three, develop a relationship that you can call on.
That's it. Yeah, adopt one of them. Go see them. Get in front of them. Get to know them. That matters. And tell them you're going to set up a PAC.
Yeah. Whether you do or not, tell them you're going to set it.
Yeah, that's right.
We better not do that, folks.
Sometimes you can save a lot of money that way.
They may hold us to it. Gentlemen, thank you both for being with us. Let's give them a hand, folks. They did a great job. Thank you.